What's going on? In today's video, we're going to go over 7 things you need to know about how to use nutrition in your diet to recover and heal faster from an injury that you might have sustained playing basketball or in the gym or in the weight room somehow. Unfortunately, as much as injuries suck, they are a part of playing a sport like basketball, and we can do as much as we want to try to prevent them, try to mitigate injury risk. Things like paying attention to your diet, that is something that can actually lower injury risk or increase it if you do it the wrong way, but that's a topic for a different video. It still happens sometimes, and I know they suck and you love playing basketball, so being forced to be sidelined, it's just not fun. It's grueling. It's honestly one of the toughest parts of playing a sport like basketball. And to add to that, there's also the possibility of regressing and losing that progress that you made as a basketball player through all your hard work when you were healthy. Are you afraid that you're going to lose all that and you have to start from ground zero? What I want to go over today are a handful of things that you can implement to minimize that regression and maintain as much progress as you can during that injury recovery period, and also speed up the healing process so you can get back on the court in the gym as soon as possible, because I know how much you want to get back out there. And just like nutrition plays a massive role in injury prevention, it also plays a role in fueling your body for recovery and making sure your body has all the resources and energy that it needs to actually rebuild and re-heal effectively. But the first thing we want to look at is what are the negative aspects of immobilization. And in today's video, we're going to specifically talk about injuries where it requires the immobilization of a certain limb or a muscle. You can't really use it. Not really discussing traumatic brain injuries or anything like that in this specific video, just keep that in mind. The main issue with injuries that require you to immobilize a limb, which means you can't move it, you can't use it, or you have to severely restrict the activity of that certain muscle or body part, is the risk for muscle loss. And that happens because of a decrease of muscle protein synthesis, because you're not getting that stimulus, and your muscles also become a little bit less sensitive to the protein you're eating, so you put yourself at risk for a decrease in muscle protein synthesis. And whenever muscle protein breakdown outweighs muscle protein synthesis, that's when muscle loss occurs. Now, the good thing is there are some things we can do with your nutrition to minimize that muscle loss and put you in the best position possible as you return from that injury. The first thing we need to consider with your nutrition is your energy balance. Like, how many calories you're taking in, how many calories are you expending? And common sense would dictate that when you're injured, when you're sidelined, you can't really move much, your energy expenditure would go down. And you're right in thinking that, but in some cases, especially with more severe injuries that require a lot of energy to rebuild and heal, your energy expenditure might actually increase in the short term as you heal from that injury. Not to mention, what if you're using crutches? What if you have to get around in a way that's unconventional to you and you actually end up expending quite a bit of energy? Now, it might not outweigh the amount of energy that you were expending beforehand, but the thing is, it might not go down as much as you might think it would. So that's something important to consider, because when you're recovering from injury, you don't want to be in an energy deficit, because your body needs that energy, it needs those resources to actually rebuild and restore and repair. And not to mention, if you go into a calorie deficit and you're not really training that much, or you're not training that specific muscle, specific limb, whatever the case may be, when you're not giving it that stimulus, when you're in a calorie deficit, so when you're eating less calories, you're putting yourself at greater risk for muscle loss, which is what we want to avoid. On the flip side though, you don't really want to be in a caloric surplus when you're injured, when you're not doing much. Now, this might be case dependent depending on if you're able to train other parts of your body and what your specific goals are, but let's assume your activity overall has gone down. You don't want to go into a massive calorie surplus to put on weight, because that weight you put on really isn't going to be high quality weight. It's most likely going to be body fat, and we don't want to put on a bunch of body fat while you're injured. So the best course of action here when it comes to building out your nutrition plan as far as calories go is to stay at maintenance. Try to put yourself in a position where you're not gaining unwanted weight, but you're also not losing a bunch of weight either. You're maintaining your weight, you're gonna put yourself in the best position to maintain your muscle mass and also fuel that recovery process effectively without putting on a bunch of extra body fat. Now, the next thing we want to consider, step number 3 here, is going to be your protein intake. So how much protein should you be eating? And protein is going to be a critical component of this entire process, because protein is what stimulates muscle growth and what provides the raw materials for muscle growth to occur. So you don't want to undereat protein, because that's going to put you at a greater risk for muscle loss. And if your injury that you sustained was something involving a muscle or a tendon or a ligament, proteins make those up. So if you're decreasing your protein intake or not eating enough of it overall, you might impair the healing process. And in general, a good place to start with protein intake would be about 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. So for example, a 200-pound individual will be looking to eat about 200 grams of protein. You might even want to up that a little bit if you want. That's a good place to start. So it's not too much, but it is going to give you enough to support that process and minimize that muscle loss. And when you consider how you eat this protein throughout the day, try to space it out pretty evenly and aim for about 20 to 40 grams of protein with each meal. That's going to help maximize maximize that muscle protein synthesis after each meal and help minimize that muscle loss. Because remember, we want to maximize muscle protein synthesis as much as we can during this period of inactivity when you don't have that stimulus that you're getting from training. And if possible, try to get protein from animal-based sources. Those tend to be more bioavailable, a bit higher quality in terms of protein and the amino acid profile. So just consider that. If you are plant-based, consider increasing your protein intake slightly by about 20%. Another possible recommendation that isn't as clear in the research, so I honestly wouldn't take this and run with it, but some people consider supplementing with something like essential amino acids or something like leucine, which is an essential amino acid that is responsible for triggering muscle protein synthesis, as a way to stimulate that even more. Now, like I said, I wouldn't recommend going and running with this. So I just want to put on your radar. If you want to do your own research into this and come to your own conclusion, by all means go ahead, but I wouldn't take that at face value and say, okay, I'm going to supplement with essential amino acids. If you see that around, just know the research on that is not very conclusive just yet. And then for the next step, we're going to look at carbohydrates and fat. And carbohydrates, obviously your energy needs or your carbohydrate needs might go down a little bit just because of that decreased activity, but that does not mean to go keto or to go low carbohydrate, because carbohydrates are protein sparing and your body still needs carbohydrates, especially if you're still training at some capacity. Let's say you broke an arm or something, and again, I'm purely speculating here, I'm not a doctor or anything, but let's say you're still doing leg training, or you can still do something. You're gonna want to have carbohydrates to fuel that training, whatever the case may be. And even if you weren't training, that doesn't mean to cut out carbohydrates. Your needs might reduce a little bit, but you don't want to cut them out. And the cool thing about carbohydrates is that they're protein sparing. So they're going to help you maintain as much muscle as possible, because your body is going to preferentially burn carbohydrates versus breaking down muscle tissue to create carbohydrates. So definitely don't feel the need to drastically cut carbs just because your activity has decreased a little bit. And if you have any questions about your individual situation, because like I said, it's super individualized, just comment down below and let me know. And for fat, what we're going to be looking at is pretty similar to when you were not injured. Just make sure you get your fat from healthy sources, like things like olive oil, avocado, other healthy oils, nuts, nut butters, peanut butter, some omega-3s from things like salmon, sardines, etc. Those are going to help you fight inflammation and just keep you overall healthy as you go throughout the healing process. And then the next thing we're going to look at as far as supporting that healing process is going to be things like vitamins and minerals. And should you supplement with them or should you get them from whole foods? And the reality is you should be focusing on getting most of your vitamins and minerals in from whole foods if possible, from things like fruits, vegetables, and pretty much all whole unprocessed foods are going to have some sort of vitamins and minerals in there. Even things like meat and nuts and nut butters, you're still going to get plenty of vitamins and minerals from those. So you want to cover your bases from whole foods. And the general consensus here in the research is that obviously deficiencies should be corrected. So if you're deficient in a certain vitamin or mineral, you should likely supplement with it. But supplementing with what are called supra-physiological doses, which means higher than you would see just naturally through food or in your body, is not really necessary and is not really going to help you a ton. So the general recommendation here would be to consume foods that are going to help fight inflammation, foods that contain these antioxidants naturally and vitamins and minerals naturally, and consider avoiding foods that are going to promote this sort of inflammation. That doesn't mean cut them out completely, like things like fast food and pizza and ice cream and all that stuff. That doesn't mean you can't have them ever, but would I recommend having them every single day, every single meal, day in and day out? Probably not. And that's not even moderation at that point. That's just overdoing it. So don't go crazy with things that you know are going to promote that inflammation and maybe hinder the healing process a little bit. Again, don't demonize these foods, but just keep that in mind, especially if you're looking to return to the court as soon as you possibly can. And then another thing that you're really going to want to consider is making sure to limit your alcohol intake. If you're of age and you're considering should I have a beer or not, just consider the consequences. Alcohol is going to potentially suppress muscle protein synthesis, which is what we don't want to happen during this entire process. And just the overall health effects of alcohol are not too great. So it's something to consider. And again, just like with the fried foods and inflammation producing foods, it's not that you need to cut them out completely, just be mindful of your intake and don't overdo it. And again, it just comes down to what your priorities are. Like, do you really want to maximize your return to play and speed this up as much as possible? Or are you okay with slowing that down a little bit for the sake of a little bit more enjoyment in your diet, whatever you define enjoyment as? And then other things to consider when it comes to supplementation and things to include in your diet to support the healing process. So things like creatine could potentially have some benefits in terms of retaining lean muscle mass and also improving your strength gains as you return to play, as you go through rehab. So it's something to consider. It's not going to be a cure-all that's going to improve all your issues, but it is something to consider and you might want to experiment with it and see if it works for you. could also consider supplementing with omega-3s, especially if you're not getting enough from your diet. Like if you're not having a lot of fatty fish in your diet, like salmon and sardines, it might be something to consider supplementing with something like a fish oil or another omega-3 supplement. And that'll be especially helpful if inflammation is excessive and you're trying to kind of quell that. And there's also some evidence to suggest that it might help to maintain muscle mass during this process. Now, there isn't like a specific recommended dose specifically for injury healing, but in general, the recommendation seems to be around 2 grams per day, and that's what most supplements are dosed at. So to stick with that, don't go with anything crazy. Again, there's no point in really going to supraphysiological doses versus just taking what is normal, what is naturally found in food in your body. And then one more bonus thing to consider when you're going through this entire process, all these things are great with your diet, but if you're not sleeping enough, you're not gonna maximize these benefits and you're gonna impair that healing process. Now, I have 2 other videos on the channel going over sleep, so I'll put them on the screen right now. Make sure you go check those out, and of course, drop a like on this video and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in that next video.